Welcome to The Whole View. I'm Stacy Toth of Real Everything, and I'm here each week to dive deeper into how we can find happiness and health inside and out through self-love, body positivity, and discovering new ways to be our best selves. Before we get started, a reminder, this podcast is for general educational purposes and is not intended to diagnose, advise, or treat any physical or mental illness. And while Dr. Alok is a psychiatrist, he's not yours. And so we always recommend that you see a licensed health professional accordingly. That said, I want to welcome Dr. K is what people call you. But as I mentioned while we were chatting, it's important to me to respect people's names. And so it's Alok
Mhm.
Kanojia as
Kanojia.
Dr.
Yeah.
Kanojia. Okay, there we go. And you are a doctor, psychiatrist, but also an incredible online educator of multitude of things, but specifically founder of Healthy Gamer and host of both the Healthy Gamer GG podcast as well as YouTube with over 2 million subscribers. And listeners, you may have heard him on the Diary of the CEO or Mel Robbins podcast, and his book, How to Raise a Healthy Gamer, helps readers overcome screen addiction and set healthy boundaries with technologies, which I get so many questions on as the mom of multiple teenage boys. And I think also, as you say, with tech companies investing billions of dollars on research to get and hold the attention of people, especially children, parents are really the only potential protection from screen addiction and creating some healthy boundaries that children have before they reach adulthood. And so your book provides readers with critical information that they need about gaming culture, how gaming affects developing brains, and proven solutions to treat addiction or simply build healthier habits. And beyond gaming, the same type of addiction is affecting our well-being with other online addictions. Specifically, men under 45 are at a high
Mhm.
risk of suicide, which you can't be healthy if you're feeling suicidal, that's for sure. And we talk a lot about women's health on this show. And I'm excited to go a little bit broader with you as someone, especially in a house full of testosterone and a constant battle to balance screen times. So welcome to the show, Dr. K. I'm so excited that you're here to share your wisdom. I would love if maybe you could start with a little bit about yourself. What brought you to focus on this area?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up playing a lot of video games, and my parents didn't know how to handle that. So they were both doctors and understood some about addiction, but technology addiction is just so different, right? It's pervasive. We're using it all the time. And so even part of the reason that I wrote the book is because I was thinking back to what my parents should have done differently and everything that I've learned working in addiction psychiatry and like realize that parents need this resource because this is new. And so I struggled a lot with technology addiction, failed out of college, and my parents tried everything. They tried tough love, they tried being like supportive and very loving, like love, kind love, soft love. And nothing seemed to work because they just didn't understand what was going on in my brain, in my mind. So finally, after about 3 years of frustrated attempts to get me to study and play less video games, play fewer video games, my dad said, like, I don't know what else to do. So, like, you need to go to India. And I was like, do what in India? And he's like, I'm going to send you, if you're okay with it, you'll go to an ashram. Like, I don't know what you need. I can't give it to you, but like, you may find it over there. So I went to an ashram or a monastery for about 3 months in the summer when I was 21 years old. And at the end of that summer, decided to become a monk. So I absolutely fell in love with what I found there, which was basically a system to understand yourself. So we formally teach about things outside of us. We'll teach civil engineers how to build bridges. We'll teach medical doctors about the heart, the brain, the mind. But we don't teach people how they work. Why do you get addicted to things? Where do your desires come from? Where does discipline come from? Where does motivation come from? How do you focus your mind? We don't teach these basic things. And so I loved that so much, I decided to become a monk. My teachers wouldn't take me. They said, you got to finish your education, come back when you're 30, and if you're still interested, then we'll take you. And it turns out that they were very wise, as I knew them to be. And so I ended up meeting my wife. The whole monk thing didn't work out. And after about 7 years on that path, decided to leave that path, go to medical school, became a psychiatrist, and then started to focus on technology addiction because many people weren't. This was back in like 2015. So tech addiction, like I thought it was a huge problem, but everyone was focused on the opioid crisis in the United States. So started working with gamers and then really realized that like these people need help. So I started streaming on Twitch. We were the fastest growing stream on Twitch for about 3 months. And there was just a huge appetite for young men who wanted help and wanted to understand like why they are the way they are, how to improve, how to get better control over themselves. And so that's where Healthy Gamer was born.
It is such a fascinating story. And as someone who I feel like I truly changed by reading Jay Shetty's book and him sharing his experiences of what sounds very similar to what
Mhm.
changed your life, I can see how that would have been a catalyst for incredible like self-awareness and wanting to help others and going from not being able to finish school to not only finishing school but medical school and then helping others in this profound way is a really cool story. So, thanks for the work that you're doing and for sharing that with us. And I think also one of the things that fascinates me is not just this idea that like we're not taught these things about ourselves. I could go on endlessly about like why are we learning X, Y, and Z in the school system, but not ABC? And at least now my kids are learning how to do taxes and balance checkbooks in
Mhm.
school. So that's cool. But there's so many things that we're not taught, like self-regulation, healthy coping mechanisms, like some things
Yeah,
that feel like they're really basic life skills that we could all benefit from. But there is also absolute scientific basis for this work. It is not just feelings, it is not just this kind of woo type thing, right?
yeah,
Like there is a brain chemistry at play in things like why are we addicted to things or why does
absolutely.
something draw us in, blah blah blah. Can you share a little more about some of the statistics or some of that kind of the basis for why this is so important for listeners to maybe they don't have young folk yet playing video games in their house? Like, what do they need to be aware of?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I think this is something that a lot of people are already running into. And even if you're not running into it, your kids will run into it. So the first thing is technology is pervasive. Um, 98% of people under the age of 30 play some kind of video game. Like that oftentimes shocks people because people think that gamers are like in the minority of the population, but that's not true. The rates of video game addiction have climbed from about 6% in 2010 to somewhere between 12 and probably even on the high end, 18% today. So we've seen a doubling or even tripling of like technology addiction. So I think the reason that this is really important is because game developers and app developers, social media developers, even people who make TV shows are getting better at engaging your brain. So I don't know if they really understand like all of the brain chemistry, but they don't need to. What they really do is product development. So even if you look at the icons on your phone, those have been tested. So they've tested like 6 different colors and they figured out which color is makes you the most likely to click. So that's interfering with your literally your occipital cortex and what sort of engages you and stuff like that. So there's billions of dollars being poured into getting you to click. So right now what's going on is there's a war between all the platforms. All the big platforms want your attention. The problem is that the harder that they compete for it, the one person who always loses is you. And your kids will run into the same problem. Even if they don't have a problem now, technology is only going to get more advanced. People are going to get better and better at this. And at some point, your child will struggle with a healthier relationship with technology. That's why we advocate for restraint instead of restriction. So a lot of parents will think like, okay, since this is so bad, I just need to keep it away from them. But then what I've seen as an addiction psychiatrist is that sometimes you'll have parents who are very controlling of their kids. And then when their kids go off to college or when they get some amount of freedom, they don't have those regulation skills. So once they get into something, they get absolutely hooked. So what we do is combine some of these neuroscience clinical perspectives with sort of these spiritual perspectives of like self-training. This isn't really religious. It's more like meditation. And there's a lot of neuroscience evidence to support this stuff, teaching self-regulation and coping skills so that you don't become addicted to technology. And that's what our approach is.
I really appreciate the call out of keeping things so tight within the home as a parent. I think when your children are younger, you start down that path. And it is really hard as a parent to let go of control, to put your children in a place where they could get hurt or they could get offended or they could be exposed to something that you're not ready to talk to them about. And at the same time, I tell myself as a parent, I would rather be the one to have that conversation with my child than for it to happen outside the house when they don't have my perspective or guidance of someone who is mature or whatever the case may be. And I think that transition is where a lot of parents get stuck. Like, I just went to my middle schooler's graduation today and I was looking at all those kids, like, it is such an awkward phase because they're literally
Yeah.
like, you're looking at kids who are transitioning out of childhood into teenage, more adult selves, and they are so awkward and uncomfortable. Every single one of them, looking around, none of them has this innate sense of confidence or self-awareness or anything. And I'm like, these children are so susceptible to what could be presented to them if it boosts their confidence, boosts their self-esteem, does these sort of things that I know everything that is online is trying to do to capture attention and time and those sort of things. And then once you're in those apps, the algorithm is just gonna it's like a feedback loop of what
Hmm.
it is you're absorbing. It's not saying, "Oh, you're going down a path of something that isn't healthy for you. Let me show you this happy dog video instead." That's not what it's doing, right? And so for me, it causes me to wonder, like, what then is the root cause that drives these behaviors longer term, right? Like, they get sucked in at this early kind of vulnerable state. And then not just children. I want to be really clear. And love my husband. We've been married 22 years. He produces this podcast. And he right now is like, oh, Stacy did this podcast for me because he struggles as someone with ADHD. He struggles all the time with getting sucked in and addicted to video games. And he knows that this is a problem for him. And he actively works on things to avoid it. But people get sucked in no matter what their age, right? And it's like,
I'm
what is this root cause that becomes, especially for males? Because yes, women will play Bejeweled or whatever, but it is especially for males, this like draw to not just gaming, but also online pornography or unhealthy online social habits, right? Engaging in risky kind of conversations online. And
Mhm.
it could be romantic in nature or it could be violence in nature. Like, there could be all these different kinds of things that people, especially males, are becoming susceptible to as they go through that process. And I'm wondering if, from a psychological perspective, from a societal perspective, are you seeing what you think might be a root cause?
Yeah, so I think I wouldn't say that there's a root cause. So I think it's very what we call multifactorial and it's very cyclic. So this is really important to understand from a neuroscience perspective. If we look at like alcohol addiction, alcohol is a chemical compound that travels to your brain, and wherever there's a certain receptor called a GABA receptor, it activates that receptor. So it's like a homing missile. Like, it goes to certain parts of your brain and activates certain parts of your brain. That's how biological addictions usually start. But if you look at someone's brain when they're using a piece of technology, it affects many parts of the brain. And this development that we've talked about, why are things getting more addictive? The reason they're getting more addictive is because they're having a more whole brain effect. So they don't just addict to one receptor. What they're doing is working on so many different dimensions. And just to give you an example of that, so there are these games called role-playing games. In role-playing games, you have a character, you have a virtual character. They used to be single-player games. Now they created, with games like EverQuest and World of Warcraft, they developed this whole community aspect where there's a persistent virtual universe where you have friends and guild mates, and people will even meet online and end up getting married in real life through like meeting on these games. So what it used to be that a game was just about dopamine. And now we're adding this community aspect to it. We're adding friendships, we're adding kind of communication to it. And this is what we see is that, just as you said, we have these intrinsic vulnerabilities. Like, let's say you're a 13-year-old boy and you feel awkward. And this is the problem with gaming addiction and the internet, is that it takes these vulnerabilities and it kind of preys on them. So now you feel a little bit awkward, especially your body is going through changes. Maybe you've got acne, maybe you're not happy about your weight or whatever it is. And so then there's two options for socialization. I can either socialize in real life, or I can socialize in a way where no one sees my face, no one makes fun of me. I get to choose the people that I hang out with instead of going to school and being bullied by the same kids over and over again. So what we're starting to see is not just this like dopamine stuff, but a lot of sense of safety, a lot of sense of community. And then what we end up seeing is a social skills atrophy. So there's studies that show that if you don't look at faces, when you spend a lot of time communicating online through direct messages or even voice chat, the parts of your brain that judge facial expressions, tone, and body language start to atrophy. So if you don't use it, you lose it. And then what happens is these are normally the things that make us feel comfortable when we're in social situations. My brain is processing lots of information about, okay, this person is relaxed, this person is making eye contact, this person is laughing. But then those parts of the brain, which already are not very well developed for teenagers, start to become underdeveloped. And then real life situations become very socially anxiety provoking. So people don't like hanging out with people. I feel isolated. This compounds on the teenage experience where I feel isolated. So now what we've done is the video game or the technology has made it harder to engage in real life, has made it easier to engage in the virtual world. And then the cycle repeats. And so that's just one example of like a neuroscience intervention. And that's why what we're really finding is that the parenting skills of the past don't translate into the modern day. So if you think a little bit about how do we learn how to parent, we do basically what our parents did. But our parents did not have to deal with a technologically invasive society. So we're finding that parents really need to learn a new way of communicating with their kids, connecting with their kids, because your kid now has like a communication atrophy too. They're not great at understanding their feelings. They're not great at articulating them. They're retreating into their device all the time. And so that's what we really try to do is lay out like a stepwise process to reconnect with your kid and learn how to communicate with them more effectively. That's what we do in How to Raise a Healthy Gamer.
What do you think the particular reason that this is a draw for male children, especially? Like, I know what I think.
Go for it.
Well, I think from a cultural perspective, we are less flexible and less supportive of males having relationships in a healthy way, that we make fun of even something like a bromance when males are bonding together. And I don't think that it's easy for males to have healthy relationships together. And so therefore, a community inside a video game where it feels safe and you can be yourself and you can giggle or you can yell or you can do these things and feel safe is a place where you just want to spend more and more time.
Yeah, that's absolutely a part of it, right? So we tend to be not very forgiving for young boys who are testing boundaries, things like that. There are a couple of other factors. So I think one huge factor is that if you look at one of the key things that keeps video games addictive, it is actually emotional regulation. So over time, what happens with games is that they actually stop becoming a fun the more addicted you get. It's just like any other drug, where you develop a tolerance to that dopaminergic signal. So I certainly experienced this when I was addicted. I would play for 14 hours a day, but it's not like I'm having a blast. Like the first 1 or 2 hours is a lot of fun. And then like I just can't stop, but I'm even getting frustrated. So you'll see a lot of like people raging and stuff like that on even when they're gaming. They're not having fun. It feels like an awful experience to them. So a big part of what we see is that video games will regulate our emotions for us. So they suppress our negative emotional circuitry. Now, this is a particular vulnerability that boys have because, first of all, their brains may be a little bit different. So we know that the effect of estrogen, so estrogen makes us more aware of our internal emotional state. Boys tend to have lower estrogen, so they're not really even aware of what they're feeling. This is called normative male alexithymia. I know it's a complicated term, but alexithymia means colorblind to your emotions. So you don't know what you're feeling. So oftentimes, if you're a parent, you'll notice this in your boys where you can tell something is wrong and you ask them, hey, is something wrong? And they're like, no, everything's fine. Everything's fine. Right? And sometimes that's confusing for parents because you can clearly tell that something is wrong, but they're not aware that something is wrong. Their awareness of their internal emotional state, they're colorblind to it. They don't see it. And the reason we call this normative male alexithymia is because this is normal for men. So this is a feature, this emotional color blindness is actually like common in the average boy or man. So now what we have is an unawareness of emotions. So if there are negative emotions, all the boy figures out is when I play the game, it feels better. I'm not even having fun, but it suppresses my negative emotional circuitry. So that makes them very vulnerable to using technology and video games as a coping mechanism. The problem is that as you use those games as a coping mechanism, you become dependent on it. And remember, it's suppressing your emotional experience. So you're never going to learn about your emotions, right? It's if I start taking the elevator everywhere instead of always taking the stairs, over time, it's going to be harder and harder for me to take the stairs. It becomes a crutch. So we see that vulnerability in boys quite a bit, that kind of manages their emotions for them. And then there's all kinds of other things like ADHD. Boys are more impulsive. Boys are much more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. ADHD is a huge vulnerability for video game addiction. The comorbidity is somewhere around 30%, which is like staggering in the medical field. So it's very high.
It is interesting to consider the hormonal implications of when we say, you know, boys and girls, males, females. I want to be clear that we're talking about a biological and hormonal effect. I have a non-binary child who I try to be cognizant of when we're saying things like male children and it's fascinating to put it into perspective like you did around how biological females are more aware of our own emotions, even if they might identify as masculine, how they're going to process
Mhm.
these feelings that they're going through the video game is going to be entirely different. And how I myself, as someone who is the 2% of people not playing video games, don't worry, I'm spending a ton of time on social media. I've still got my internet time going, but I just don't have an interest in it because I find that it's a time waste, because I find that I'm like, why would I want to get sucked into this and feel frustrated that like, for me, the only thing I'm interested in are games like Tetris or something, right? And then when I don't succeed as I want to succeed, then I just want to play again and again. And I feel frustrated. And then I look and it's been 2 hours and all I've
Yeah.
got to show for it is frustration. I think that part of that comes with being older and having self-awareness, but also I recognize that as also I'm not like an ADHD neurodivergent person who's not in touch with myself the way that all of my boys are. I have a whole house full of ADHD testosterone. So I am curious as we're looking at the likelihood of these, as you said, like the comorbidity of ADHD and the addiction of video games, if there are other risks for people to become addicted, right? Like, is there, as you are either the partner of or the parent of someone, and you're concerned, hey, maybe they're taking this a little too seriously, a little too far. They don't seem to be feeling good after they spend time. Like, what are some of those warning signs to look?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think a couple things. The first is that as your parent, the most important warning sign is your gut. So it's not a specific sign, but as parents, we're very biologically attuned to our kids. And if you think something is wrong, there's a decent chance something is wrong. That being said, there are a lot of things that increase the risk of video game addiction. So we talked about neurodiversity. It turns out that non-binary or gender-related issues also can correlate with technology addiction. So basically any kind of neurodiversity, any kind of other substance use. And in this way, like marijuana is like absolutely a gateway drug. So there's very good evidence that shows that substance use, especially during our teenage years, alter our brain chemistry to make us more susceptible to dopaminergic addictions in the future. So oftentimes we'll see like gamer culture and the pothead culture. It's not quite like that. We're seeing a lot of decriminalization and usage of marijuana in much healthier ways, but those two cultures really get along. It's like, let's get high and play video games and have munchies and eat Doritos. And there's a whole lifestyle for young men that is very glorified there.
Thor from the Avenger series comes to mind, right? Like the cliche is based in facts, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that those are certainly there. We also see a lot of comorbidity also with like mood disorders. So remember once again that video games can be used as an emotional coping mechanism. So if a child is suffering from something like depression or major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, it's much more likely that they'll get into games, and those two like feed each other. So on the one hand, the video game helps you manage your feelings of depression in the moment, but over time prevents you from making substantial changes to actually improve your life. And so the more you play video games, the more depressed you feel. The more depressed you feel, the more you need to play video games. So we see a lot of comorbidities. Outside of the diagnoses, we also see that basically like the more trauma, bullying, social isolation, even other kinds of risk factors like divorce can increase the risk of becoming addicted to video games. Basically, anything that generates negative emotions in an extreme way will increase the risk of some kind of addiction. And nowadays, if you're 13, the easiest thing available is technology.
It makes a lot of sense to me that the depressed creating depression, because as someone who has been live on the internet for 15 years, I've been putting myself out there, so to speak. It aligns with something that you said in your book, which you mentioned that people can be dark and shadowy and nasty and show those sides of themselves on the internet because, as you mentioned earlier, you're not showing your face, you're not having to be confronted really by anyone, that you can like put your negativity out there and turn it off and run away. And oftentimes people on the internet are cruel to one another. And I hear it when my children are playing video games and I'm hearing conversations that they're having, that part of that is in jest, that they will mock and that's part of their culture. But also part of it is just really being mean or nasty. And I see it a lot in social media where this idea of trolling comes from, right? Where we know that the person could not possibly be happy if their intent is to hurt one another, to literally create accounts where all you're doing is going around and saying hurtful things. You're like literally dropping a turd on fire on someone's doorstep, and then that makes you feel better and you run away. And the idea that there are hurt people who hurt people is something I have to remind myself of regularly, that like, it's really not about me if someone is mean or whatever, but that comes from maturity, right? Like most people who are, whether it's gaming or they're on social media, if they're younger, like it's not that you have this ability to kind of partition what someone says to you and not internalize it. That I know that comes from maturity and therapy and all that kind of stuff over years. And so I'm wondering how we can help protect our teens from this kind of thing on the internet. Not just maybe they're not the one being trolled, but they're looking on an account or they're reading comments on a YouTube video or they're seeing or hearing things following a Twitch, like whatever it might be. How do they realize that's not an appropriate way to talk to someone, that this is not content that I want to expose myself to? How do we instill those mindsets to a younger generation? Because I know I couldn't have done it at 16. Like
Yeah,
into my
it's such a great
40s.
question.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great question. So how do we like protect them from this stuff? How do we teach them to be responsible? So I know it's crazy, but I'd say like this is what kind of in some ways sets us apart. I think the goal actually isn't to instill something. I know it's crazy. So what we found is the most effective is actually encouraging conversation and inquiry. So right now, what tends to happen is most parents will be separated from their children's online life, right? Like the kid is on the tablet, they have a computer, they have a laptop, they have a phone. You're not looking over their shoulder. There's an expectation of privacy. You don't know what they're seeing, what they're not seeing. And if you look at like parents who will try to tell their kids, okay, drugs are bad, that has a varying effect on the kid, right? Some kids will ignore that. Some kids won't ignore that. So what we really recommend is have conversations with your child and be involved. Like that really is the best thing that you can do. And then what we really also recommend is to invite your child to consider some of these things for themselves. So especially if we're talking about teenagers, they don't really respond great, depends on your kid, but as a whole, they don't respond great to being told what to do. They think they understand, so they have the capacity for reason, but it's quite primitive, right? So they don't realize that. They don't have very good insight into their logical shortcomings. So what we really want to encourage is discussion. So it's talking to your kid about, hey, when you see this kind of stuff, what impact does it have on you? Does it have an impact? What do you think about it? And simply getting children to articulate. And we've done studies on this where just getting children to articulate their experience of what being on the internet is like moves them in the right direction. So even if you look at, there's a really fascinating study on female bullying. And if you have a bullying situation, punishing the bully can actually increase the amount of bullying. The best thing to do if you have a situation of a girl bullying another girl is to get them to talk about their experiences, not even call it right or wrong. Just have them articulate, when you say this kind of stuff, where does that come from? Like, what are you feeling? And hearing the other person's experience, just simply articulating our feelings, which is something that Freud figured out a couple hundred years ago, or about 100 years ago. That's enough. So that's really surprises a lot of parents that like speaking about their experience moves them in the right direction. We think we have to convince them of something. And as parents know, like your kids are going to be the most independent when they figure things out for themselves, not when you tell them, when you have to tell them 1,500 times. I have to tell them all the time, I don't understand why do they don't learn. That's exactly why they don't learn, because you're telling them 1,500 times, right? So anything that you do for a child is not something that they're going to do for themselves. And what we really want to foster is independence and for them to be able to restrain themselves. And so what we strongly encourage is be involved. Learn if they're playing games, like learn about the game, watch them play it, listen to who they talk to in the game and what those conversations are like. Learn to play it a little bit yourself. Ask them, what's your experience of this? What do you like about this game? What do you like about this game more than some other game? What do you think about when people say stuff like that? Do you ever feel like saying stuff like that? And then if they say, no, of course not, then you can ask why not, because the game is very rage inducing. And so as you approach it with curiosity, you'll be amazed at how much your children will open up. And once they start communicating with you, then stuff moves in the right direction. There are so many studies that show that connection between a child and a parent is what really correlates with a lot of like success and happiness and healthy relationships. So we don't focus on brainwashing them. We focus on encouraging them to notice, because then they'll notice what we all see, which is that the internet gaming is like a toxic place.
I could not agree more. I have a child who we've adopted and had exposure to the internet in a really unhealthy early way, like completely unsupervised, full access to the internet in elementary school kind of behaviors. And it took a lot of work to get to a healthier place to process. And we're also talking about a lot of the things that you mentioned earlier in terms of comorbidities with mental health and different things like that. And so as you were talking, I just was thinking about all the times that we had breakthrough, and it wasn't of me kind of monitoring conversations, because we did need to do that for a while in order to get to a healthy place. It wasn't of me telling them to do certain things. It was asking questions like, oh, what game are you playing? And what kind of conversations are you in? And fascinating that she'll like eventually the child does say like, gosh, I was in this chat room and someone was being anti-LGBTQ, and it just, so then I went to their page and I made fun of the way they look. And I'm like, is that really best use of your time? Like, did you feel good after you did that? And that, like you're saying, like this light bulb goes off where when you're being inquisitive and instead of being like, that's not okay, I don't want you exposed to that, turn it off, blah, blah, blah. Right. Like seeing their ability to process and do all of that. But I will say that the part where I have a really, really, I continue to struggle with is not on the video game front. It's on the TikTok front right now. Like the algorithms are so strong in terms of like if you have an unhealthy kind of interest, so to speak, right? Like if, for example, disordered eating is something that you're thinking about because you have teenage experience, and it's rampant. I'm sure you tell me a statistic that would scare everybody. Or another one is toxic masculinity type mindset, right? Where I see, and my children will tell me, oh my gosh, you should have seen this, blah, 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 or some so-and-so was talking about whatever. Mom, did you see this video? They can identify it because we've talked about it and it's something that we're very open in the house. But I know that it is such a problem because oftentimes you won't even realize the person, whoever it is, adult or child, doesn't even realize that they're getting sucked into
Mhm.
a lot of these online kind of pulls because, as you're saying, it's not just the video games that do that emotional regulation, it's also on social media or different kind of things where your emotions are tied to the emotions of whoever it is that you might be tied with on social media or whatever it is. And I think looking at some of the content that's out there, you're watching one video which you're, oh, that's interesting. And so you're watching it and then it serves you something else. And then all of a sudden you're like, whoa, how did I get to Andrew Tate? Like whatever it might be. And I think that's where it's hard for me to, because I am not a controlling parent. I'm very much like a freeform parent, but the one area where I still feel like an uncomfortable pull of like, this worries me still about my teenage children is the time and what they're being served by TikTok because they can't control it. I think that's the part that worries me is like, I can talk to them and I can put my trust in them, empower and educate them, but it's not even within their control. And it's hard then to have healthy coping mechanisms or self-regulation or do those kinds of things other than shutting it down or saying no. Oftentimes, like, the algorithm will serve you something simply because you're watching it, and you're watching it because it's a train wreck, and, like, you don't wanna continue
Yeah.
to watch the train wreck, but it keeps serving it to you, right?
Y- Yeah. So I think there's so much there. So let's like start with some of the basics. So the first thing is, well, see, this is what a lot of people need to understand. So all of these platforms, what they really run on is emotional engagement. So if you get bored, you're going to move on. And what no app wants is for you to be bored with that app. So you open up a different app, which is less boring. So now the question becomes what determines boring versus not boring? And this is what really surprises people is that the number one emotion that I've seen that TikTok engages is like righteousness. So what they do is they ping pong your emotions because your brain will get addicted to, see, anytime we have a stable signal, we acclimatize to it. So if I walk into a party, the party feels really loud right at the beginning, but my brain has this way of filtering out noise. We filter out stable signals, whether it's noise at a party, temperature when we're walking outside, whatever it is, we'll filter stuff out. So once we filter things out, we'll get bored, we'll move on. So what the platforms will do is they'll actually alternate between things that really piss me off and things that make me feel really good, things that are really funny, and then back to being pissed off again. And the more that they ping pong you, and you'll see this as well in people who are in abusive relationships, people are oftentimes confused, like, why is this person in this abusive relationship? And it's because the abuser figures out how to ping pong your emotions. They'll love bomb you and they'll abuse you. And human beings, anytime there's a random reinforcement schedule, this is why gambling is a thing, right? Casinos use this. Anytime we ping pong our emotions, we tend to get addicted to something. So now the second question becomes, okay, so this is happening. This is why the kids are doing it. They may not even realize it, but they're being engaged as well. This is also why we see a lot of like extreme content, because over time to get the same draw out of you, I need to like escalate, right? So this is also, we're seeing a trend towards more and more intensive and hardcore pornography because the earlier stages of pornography are not, they just don't do it for, they don't engage people's brains in the same way. So things get more and more extreme. Now, if you've got a kid who's using this stuff, I think it's very challenging, but we do have a third of the book is about how to set healthy boundaries. And so it's about building an alliance first so they understand where you're coming from and then helping them set healthy boundaries. And a great place to start with TikTok is like, what makes you like TikTok? Why do you use it? What is the impact on you? How much time do you spend on it? Do you want to be spending that much time? Which is the time that you spend on TikTok? And what we tend to find is that TikTok especially is really good at squeezing in between things. So they'll take any time you're in the elevator, if you're waiting or you're on the toilet or something like that, you'll open up TikTok. And then, you know, a 2-minute time in the toilet now becomes 15 minutes where you're sitting there. So it squeezes into all these places and really asking people, what do you enjoy about it? And oftentimes it's things like, I feel like I keep up with what's going on. There's a very, very current, but what are you keeping up with? right? You're keeping up with what the algorithm is serving you and really helping people understand. And there's certain conversational techniques that we use that are evidence-based techniques to help people understand when something is damaging for them. So these are things like open-ended questions and reflective listening. This is what confuses a lot of parents, that they think that I need to teach my kid. You don't need to teach your kid. What you need to do is encourage them to articulate things and then reinforce what they say. So if a kid says, "Oh, I really like TikTok," and it's like, "Okay, what do you like about it? Does it cost you anything?" And then when they say, "Yeah, it cost me this," and be like, "Wow, that must be tough that you like it on the one hand, but it also is like negatively impacting your grades or you're not getting as much stuff done." And what parents don't realize is when you repeat back their words to them, you don't say, "I told you so," but you empathize with them. That's what really causes that thought to grow in their mind, right? So they get some positive feedback around that thought. So with TikTok, I would strongly recommend that you have conversations with them. Like, why do we use this stuff? What is it doing? What do you like about it? You've spent 40 hours on TikTok over the last month. Are you happy with how you use that time? Right? What would 20 hours of TikTok versus 40 hours, what would that really cost you? So I think oftentimes asking a lot of these questions, and this is what really surprises parents, is that most kids want to spend less time on their phone. Most kids want to play fewer video games. The people in our community, we all know that playing video games for 700 hours in a year is not a good use of our time. Like, we know that. So a lot of times the problem is that when kids say something like that, they're giving their parents ammo. And then the parent says, "Yeah, see, I told you so. Now that you said it's a problem, we're going to take it away." So then the kid is put in a really challenging situation, because if they voice any negatives, the parent will jump on those. And then the kid is placed in a situation where I can never admit that anything is wrong. Because if I do, I'm equipping my parents to take it away from me. So that's why we really emphasize some of these conversational techniques, and they can absolutely work around social media addiction and TikTok too.
I also am wondering if you can speak to a little bit of the activation of those feelings that we were talking about earlier. And to me, what I've noticed, especially in the content that is being served to my male identifying children, that the feelings that seem to be ping-ponging always go back to what I'm going to call big boy feelings, right? Like this idea that anger is acceptable in males more than sadness is acceptable in males. And really, anger is like an unhealthy expression of sadness a lot of the times. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with recognizing how those male emotions are suppressed and leaning towards these socially acceptable male feelings instead?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things, because there's a biological aspect of this as well. So there are studies that boys will have more testosterone, which a lot of people focus on, but there's also like all kinds of other hormones that are important, like oxytocin. So boys will tend to have lower oxytocin, and oxytocin leads to like bonding and friendship and stuff like that. So there's absolutely a biological component. But I think a big part of it is that boys are conditioned basically to only feel anger, right? So if you look at like any of our media, right, what is the primary emotion that men will feel? They will feel like a righteous fury. So we glorify it, right? You mentioned Thor earlier. I'm sure you take your pick of the movie, at some point Thor gets pissed and we're on his side. So we're taught that anger is okay. So boys are also like, if you cry, like, you're just going to get bullied. Like, that's all that's going to happen. Like, no one is going to accept that. It's really interesting, because I think men also experience and express emotions differently. So a lot of times when boys and men become control freaks, that's actually a manifestation of anxiety. But we don't know how to articulate, "I'm worried about something." But when I am worried about something, I have to control the circumstances, because then everything will go right. And then the bad outcome I'm worried about won't happen. There's a lot of like interesting expression of emotions that men do that are not really considered okay. So if a man is anxious, we perceive that as controlling, and controlling men are bad, right? We need independence. So we tend to punish a lot of this emotional expression without understanding where it's coming from. So what this sort of results in is men are pushed towards anger. When you get bullied, you shouldn't cry. You should fight back, right? You should protect yourself. You should protect others. And anger is our emotion of like territorial defense. When we violate an animal's territory, it will respond with anger. So this is a huge part of it, that we're basically taught to only express anger. Anger also protects us from emotions like shame. So if I'm ashamed of my body, I'm going to get pissed and I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to become a macho man and I'm going to work out, right? These kids are bullying me and I'm going to transform that shame into anger, which is also a theme that we see in basically all of our media, right? When someone gets bullied, what happens? They get angry and then they change things and then they become the winner. So we're really encouraging a lot of anger. So then what this sort of ends up in is that boys are basically only allowed to feel anger if there are other emotions. Anger is also an umbrella emotion. So it covers a lot of things like fear and shame and sadness that we don't want to feel. So what's the point of being depressed? Like, I should just get angry and fix my problems. And then there are other factors as well. So we know that like boys and men are what we call, they use instrumental coping mechanisms. So that means that if something is wrong in my life, talking about it is not going to do anything. I need to fix it, right? So if I'm unhappy with my appearance, talking to a therapist about it is silly. I should just become happy with my appearance. I should do my hair differently. I should change my clothes. I should start exercising. So there's a lot of that pushes emotions away. Like, let's fix our problems instead of talk about them. So all that results in this alexithymic picture, this pro-anger picture. And then the other really interesting thing is if we talk about toxic masculinity, I think the real tragedy here is that toxic masculinity is, these people are basically the only people that validate men's emotional experiences. That's why they're growing so much. I see everyone is very good at criticizing toxic masculinity. I see very few people asking the question, why is this so popular? What is going on? And anytime you see something that grows very rapidly, it is fitting a societal or psychological need. And right now we have a culture where, boys and men are told that we're privileged, right? And that's true in a lot of statistical ways, but we're also disadvantaged in many ways. So if a boy or man says, my life is hard, oftentimes the response that they get is, but women have it harder. So that's very emotionally invalidating. And then there's one group of people who says, yeah, men have it hard. And those are the toxic masculine people. They say, yeah, life sucks. That's because you're weak. But they do say life sucks. They admit that part. And then they call you weak. And then they tell you, if you purchase my course, I will help you become an alpha male. Right? I will help you be strong. And then they give them a path forward. So they're incredibly emotionally validating. And if we want to stop toxic masculinity, what we really need to do is start listening to boys and men's experiences of their difficulties in life.
How do you suggest we do that as especially a very strong feminine listener base, right? And I'm thinking of how can I support the men and the growing boys in my life safely express their emotions? Because on one hand, I think most of us listeners say, absolutely, if my child cries or expresses their emotion, I support that. And I think to your point, you just listed off a lot of examples of how that's not being validated and supported. So what can we all do to provide some sort of either support or validation without being emasculating, without suppressing basic human emotion kind of thing?
Yeah, so I think that it's easy for a parent to be supportive when their child is crying. It's way harder for a parent to listen open-mindedly when your child says all women are bad, especially if you're a feminist or independent or just equal. Forget about I think feminist originally was about equality, which I'm a big fan of. So I think it's really hard to listen to the experiences of men when they are negative, right? So this is even the way, so I think there's a very subtle answer in your question, which is you said, these are the acceptable emotions for my son to have that I'm going to be supportive. If he cries, I'm going to listen to him. What about if he says all women are bad? Will you listen to him then? Will you say, help me understand how you come to that thinking? What's been your experience of that? So that's something that very few parents do. When we see something that we classify, so what we do is things that are emotionally okay and things that are emotionally bad. So toxicity is bad and crying about your feelings is good. So we're very supportive of people crying about their feelings, but we're not supportive of what we view as toxicity. But if you look at the evidence-based practices of psychotherapy, what we actually do is validate those unacceptable feelings. That's what therapy is all about. It's about helping someone understand. So when someone comes in and says, I'm suicidal, I want to take my life, the best thing to say as a psychiatrist is not, here are all the reasons why you should live, and there's so much to live for. What that basically tells a patient is you're wrong, you misunderstand things, and also that I don't understand as a psychiatrist, right? Instead, what you can say is, I understand you feel that way. Help me understand why you feel that way. What's going on in your life where it is no longer worth living? And this is really shocking, but there's one study that I saw that found that up to 50% of men who commit suicide have no history of mental illness. So maybe it's undiagnosed, we don't really know, but this is where like a lot of the negativity that people are experiencing, especially men, simply being able to listen to it and hold that space for them where you can let this toxicity out. And going back to this idea of like hurt people, I remember I was working with a patient who was smearing feces on the wall in their school. And what they were doing is getting punished, right? Because that's not acceptable. But very few or no one was asking the question, why is this kid doing this in the first place, right? What's going on in this kid's life? And so oftentimes what happens is men who behave in an angry fashion, no one asks why, right? We say this is bad, this is evil, and that's fair enough. Like, I'm not saying that we should say that behavior is okay. And people should be held accountable for their actions. But if you really want to know if your kid is like walking down this path of toxic masculinity, listening goes a very long way. So what tends to happen is if we're going down the path of toxic masculinity, we as a society consider this unacceptable. And so if we consider it unacceptable, we ostracize this person. And as we ostracize this person, where do they go? Right into the arms of the toxic masculine alpha males. So what we've seen in our community is the more that we allow those people to be there, we still set limits on the kind of speech that we will allow or not allow and help them understand this is not okay, this is against the rules. It's not just against the rules for people who are men, it's against the rules for everyone. So you're welcome to be here, but you have to play by the rules. And the beautiful thing is that helps rehabilitate these people, bring them back into like a non-echo chamber. And then it's really fantastic what we've seen, like the progress that we've seen in young men who are really having a lot of trouble.
I think a really good example of that, just for perspective for listeners, not even about toxic masculinity, but my 16-year-old had learned, I'm using quotation marks when I say that from TikTok, that Helen Keller wasn't real, that there was absolutely no way that there was a woman who could be inhibited the way that she was, and that she and he was convinced, he was like 100% because TikTok told him that it was all made up and it was a lie. And instead of sitting we have dinner together as a family every night, which I can't recommend strongly enough to families that are out there because I learned so much in the 20 minutes at the dinner table with my kids. Instead of being like, you are so wrong, just wrong, here's the facts. I had the exact conversation that you're saying, like, help me understand why you think this. Where is the source information of this person on TikTok? Like, have you actually checked into this yourself, right? Like a lot of questions like that. And it was 2 or 3, and we also did a lot of teasing and joking, which we do as a family. And then 2 or 3 nights later at the dinner table, he like brought it up again as a joke. And this time under his breath, he's like, yeah, I looked into it. I realized I was wrong. Right. And so it
Yeah.
wasn't me forcing something on him. And so I give that example as like of course, that's not running into the toxic masculinity type avenue. I'm hoping that I don't have to navigate those trenches with my family, but at the same time, leaving that door open and being inquisitive and asking questions and not forcing my own agenda, but also leading open-ended questions, right? I think they're
Mhm.
open-ended, but they're also like, did you really think about that? Gives a lot of space for them to figure it out on their own and to be empowered and to then like feel like they own the answer instead of mom forced it on me. So everything that you're
Absolutely.
saying.
Yeah, I think that's what you have to do, right? So they need to learn for themselves that the bar to create a TikTok is just to have an idea and open your mouth. That's it. That's all you need to do. You don't need to know anything. And it's really hard to get kids to see that until you do exactly what you did, which is encourage them to be critical thinkers. And this is something that I think is becoming more important now because I think, like, 40, 50 years ago, not anyone could open up their mouth and claim to do something, right? So there was a barrier to publishing, there was a barrier to journalism, there was a barrier to like people listening to
Ethical
you.
standards.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think all of that has basically disappeared, and anyone can open their mouth and make a video about anything. And then as long as it hits the right emotional connection, it'll grow.
Well, and I would argue that the more wild it is, the more
Absolutely.
it will grow, right? Like there aren't a lot of logical, calm, factual videos that are going viral.
Mm-mm.
That's not what's happening.
You can't have a logical com video go viral, technically, because in order to go viral, no one has like a 97-minute lecture that goes viral, right? It's clips. So when you have a 60-second, we see this a lot with mental health information, where like, in a sense, like sometimes we'll make react content to it, but in a sense, it's unfair because there's no way you can create a nuanced perspective in 60 seconds.
Absolutely. That struggle is so real in its own conversation all separately. I think one of the areas that I am curious about as an elder millennial parent, I struggle a lot with understanding AI content. And to be quite frank, I've reached that point of my adulthood where I'm just like, I am not willing to learn one more thing and to understand the impacts. But I know enough to know that I am concerned about the potential for AI in whether it's social media or whether it's online in general to create content that is not real, and whether it's aesthetics, right? Like there are a lot of implications when we're talking about filters and how teenagers now want fillers to look like their filter makes them look
Mhm.
like. And that is part of an AI perspective in my mind, right? Like that's the gateway to AI. Is this something that we can continue that conversation? And are there other kind of like things to be concerned about that I haven't even thought of yet in that area?
Yeah, so there's a lot of good stuff there. So let's start with, I think it's crazy that AI is making artwork because I thought the whole point of AI was like, I want AI to do my laundry and dishes so that I can make art. I don't need it to make art so that I can.
That meme like everywhere all the time. Like, yes, please let me hire the
It
robot to do my laundry, not to
yeah,
create
it's
my art.
weird, right? So it's absolutely a concern. So I think we're seeing a couple of different things. So you mentioned specifically people want to get fillers. So I have a lot of clients and patients that are getting cosmetic surgery in their 20s. So I think we're seeing a rise on this. So there's a couple of really interesting statistics here. Body dysmorphia is on the rise. So if you look at like the usage of fillers, or filters. So what that kind of does is I have a pretty version of myself and I have the real version of myself. And the more that those things get separated, like the more ugly the real me becomes, because relatively speaking, the more filtered version of me becomes so much more beautiful. That leads to body dysmorphia. The other thing that we're seeing is body dysmorphia used to be a predominantly female diagnosis, maybe like 5-1, 4-1. So 80% of people who had body dysmorphia were women. That is evening out. And that's something that we're seeing a lot, is that a lot of traditionally male diagnoses are now being adopted by women, or women are being diagnosed with it. ADHD is a really good example of this. So that's evening out. And then we're seeing body dysmorphia in men at an alarming level. And even some of this stuff around alpha males and beta males and toxic masculinity, I think it has a body dysmorphia component. So if you talk to these people, they're hyper fixated on like certain bodily features. Like if your chin is too recessed and you don't have like a manly chin or like a manly, like this part of your body. I've had patients who are considering like leg lengthening surgery because they've been fed this thing that if they're average height, they're never going to be able to date. So we're seeing a lot of weird body dysmorphia. As for AI, I think that AI is going to help platforms figure out what works for you in terms of engagement, right? So I think the biggest danger here is that they're just going to get better and better at reading you and creating really customized. We already see this with algorithms, but I saw something super scary, which is that I think TikTok now makes an algorithm for comments. So what used to happen, if you look at YouTube, everyone sees the same comments. But now what can happen is you can have a TikTok that has, let's say, like a conflict between a husband and wife. And if you're a man watching TikTok, you're going to get served up all the men comments. And if you're a woman on TikTok, you're going to get served up a completely different set of comments. And so that will reinforce the idea that your impression of this is correct. So it's really scary because we're seeing more and more like AI sophistication of figuring out like basically how to exploit people's brains.
And it just feeds into the extensive divisiveness in this country in such a concerning way, which is something I talk about all the time. Like, anyway, again,
Yeah.
whole other topic for a whole other day. Let's wrap on something positive. I like to always leave listeners with something actionable that they can walk away with and feel like they're either being of service to someone else or they're working on themselves. I'd love to hear any ideas that you have.
Yeah. So I think the most important thing that we need to do is just like talk to people. So I think that really just having an open-ended conversation with someone in your life about their relationship with technology and use phrases like help me understand, right? So you mentioned that your husband sometimes uses the screen too much. I'm sure my wife would have the same complaint. And so you really just ask them, help me understand what is it that makes you want to play so much? Like, help me understand what you like about TikTok. So that particular phrase is very important because it gives people the space to open up. Help me understand, Dot. Help me understand what you like about this content. Help me understand what you like about Andrew Tate. So what it really does is open people up, and then it also gives them the idea that you are trying to understand and that hopefully you do understand. So I would strongly recommend that people just talk to the people in their lives about what their experience of technology is like. The other really cool thing for a lot of parents that's really frustrating is that it feels like an antagonistic relationship between you and your kid, where you're trying to take the technology away, they're trying to hang on to it. And what we tend to find is that as a parent, once you understand, or the child believes that you understand, then they'll be a lot more amenable to your suggestions, right? So let's say you go to a doctor, two different doctors. One doctor takes the time to understand who you are as a person. The other one ignores everything about you and just looks at a set of lab tests and then makes a diagnosis. Whose advice are you much more likely to listen to? So when a human being feels understood, they will listen. But as long as they don't feel understood, you can make whatever suggestions you want. Your child will say, but they don't get me. They don't understand the situation. Therefore, the solution does not apply. So I think communication is like absolutely foundational. It transforms this dynamic of like you overcoming your child to set healthy limits on them. Instead, they become your partner. And that's really what we lay out in How to Raise a Healthy Gamer.
Do you have children?
Yeah, absolutely. 6 and 8.
6 and 8. You're going to be a great teenage parent. Took me a long time to learn a lot of things that you're talking about now. Nobody's perfect. No, nobody is ever perfect with parenting, but I had to take courses as a foster parent. One of them is called collaborative problem solving. And one of the things that they teach you, instead of help me understand, they lead with, I noticed that, whatever it is, and then saying, what's up with that? Which also gives this impression. So I actually changed it up a couple different things. I say, I noticed. I also say, help me understand. But the I noticed also helps children be seen or validated, which I know oftentimes is really difficult for teenagers too, right? Like, hey, I noticed that it's really hard for you in the mornings. Like, what's up with that? And then allowing them to walk through what it is. Because I think oftentimes as parents, we think we know, but really it might be something that you're completely unaware of. And so giving space for kids to give you those answers can be hugely helpful and beneficial. And I think also this idea that when we're spending time with our children in just listening, it can be the most powerful thing. I know that there's countless studies that talk about 20 minutes present with your children a day is better than hours of being distracted with your children a day, right? And the hardest thing for me, because I'm a solution-oriented person, is letting my children like vent about whatever their frustrations might be, and then not like telling them a solution or helping them solve the solution. But one of the questions that I find is super helpful is when they're talking, I have to ask. I just say, do you want me to listen and just be here for you, or do you want me to help you solve this problem? And 9 times out of 10, they do not want me to help them solve the problem.
Yeah.
And so then I sit there literally biting my tongue as they tell me about their friend that is totally toxic and I want them to not be friends with. But they have to come up with that on their own. And if they're sitting there telling me that information, it means that they're already 80% of the way to figuring that out on their own.
Absolutely. It reminds me of, I have just a quick story about the day I became a doctor. So this was actually 6 months after I graduated from medical school. And there was a medical emergency. And so I was an intern at the time, so I was relatively new. And so I ran into the room and the nurse is there and there's a patient who's seizing in the bed. And then my senior resident walks in and he's like kind of the boss and he's been doing this for a couple of years. So like I'm panicking and I'm like, here's what's going on. The patient is having a seizure. And he looks at me and he just shrugs. And I'm like, bro, he's having a seizure. And he's like, what should I do? And he shrugs and he says, what do you think you should do? What do you want to do? And I'm like, I don't know, give him 2 milligrams of IV Ativan or give him IV Ativan. And he's like, okay, how much do you want to give? And I was like, I don't know, 1 milligram, 2 milligram. I guess safer to do two. It's not going to hurt him. And he's like, all right, so do that. And that was the moment that I sort of like, they did not solve the problem for me. And that's what's like, I know all these answers. I know this stuff. It's just as long as this parenting figure is there, I'm not going to be able to express it and develop that confidence. And I think what you're describing is exactly the lesson that I learned, which is just have your kids articulate it. That's 80% of the way there. Beautifully said.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom today, which I know we talked a lot about teenagers and video games, but obviously I know listeners can see how this applies to so many other areas of life. If they do want to find you and follow up and learn more, can you remind us where would be the best places to do that?
Sure. So healthygamer.gg is our website. We have a ton of resources for gamers, parents, and young people alike. And so if parents want to learn more about our approach to parenting kids, they can check out our book, How to Raise a Healthy Gamer, which sort of dives into the neuroscience, the psychology, core communication skills, as well as like boundary setting and how to set limits without creating tantrums.
Would you recommend that teenagers could potentially read this for themselves and follow you on Twitch and that kind of stuff as well, not just for parents?
Yeah. So the funny thing is that the majority of our audience is the kids of the parents. So, and then I think the other thing is that if you're a kid who wants to learn how to communicate better with your parents, you should absolutely pick up the book too. Because we see a lot of reverse Unoing going around. Even my kids will walk up to me and say, I noticed that dot. And so if you want to just be a proficient communicator, we've had couples who say that the book is very helpful as well because it teaches a lot of communications. We also see a lot of people who have spouses who have trouble really benefit from it. So it's not just for parents with kids, but that's the intended audience.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here today. And listeners, we'll put a list of resources to the book and to your website and all those places on realeverything.com and in the show notes. And if you enjoyed the show today, if you could leave a review saying so, it costs you nothing but maybe 30 seconds of your time. It makes a huge difference in our ability to keep doing this work. And don't forget to follow or subscribe in whatever podcast app you're using. As always, we appreciate your willingness to be open to growth through your own personal change. No one is perfect, but in listening, learning, and unlearning, you can choose to become better versions of yourselves. And thank you, Dr. K.